On the night of November 27th, 1542, 16 women walked silently into the private chamber of the most powerful man alive. They brought no weapons, no poison, no blades, just a single silk ribbon. The Jiajing Emperor of China ruled over 120 million people. He commanded the largest army on the planet. He called himself the Son of Heaven. That night he was asleep. The women held down his arms. They forced cloth into his mouth, and then one of them, a palace maid named Yang Zhenyan, looped that silk ribbon around his throat and pulled. His body convulsed. His face changed color. He stopped moving. For roughly 2 minutes, the Emperor of China was either dead or dying. 16 women with zero military training, no political connections, and absolutely no escape plan had done what no general in the empire ever could. Then the knot jammed. The ribbon wouldn't tighten any further. Panic took over. One woman broke away and ran straight to the Empress, confessing everything. Guards arrived within minutes. The Emperor was revived. And what happened next to those 16 women, to their families, their villages, and every single person connected to their bloodlines, became one of the most thoroughly documented mass punishments in all of Imperial Chinese history. But here's what separates this from every other assassination story you've ever heard. These women already knew they would die. They knew their families would die. They knew the odds of success were almost nothing, and they did it anyway, which means whatever was happening inside those palace walls, whatever these women were living through every single day, was so extreme that mass execution genuinely felt like the better option. And if you want to understand what drove them to that point, you have to go back long before the Jiajing Emperor was ever born. The Chinese Imperial Palace was not simply a residence. It was one of the most complex personnel management operations in the ancient world. At its peak, under the Ming dynasty, the Forbidden City housed somewhere between 9,000 and 20,000 women at any given time. That figure isn't symbolic. It comes directly from palace census records and eunuch registries that survived into the modern era. These women were slotted into a rigid hierarchy. The empress sat at the top. Below her came consorts, then concubines of descending grades, then attendants, and finally, at the very bottom, palace maids, women whose entire existence revolved around labor and service, with almost no path upward and no way out. The process of filling this system was systematic and brutal. Every few years, imperial officials spread out across the empire with one specific task: find girls between the ages of 13 and 16 who met the dynasty's physical and genealogical standards. Local magistrates submitted candidates. Families had no right to refuse. The girls were inspected in stages, first for appearance, then for health, then for temperament, then for temperament. Those who passed were transported to the capital, journeys that could take weeks, chaperoned by eunuchs, with no guarantee of what awaited them at the end. Once inside the palace, their names were logged in registries, and their previous identities were essentially erased. They were assigned ranks, quarters, and duties. The vast majority would never leave those walls again. Daily life was dictated entirely by protocol. Women rose before dawn. Their every movement was tracked by eunuchs, castrated men, who served as the palace's internal security force. Under the Ming dynasty, the eunuch population inside the Forbidden City ranged from 12,000 to 20,000. They monitored hallways, recorded conversations, and reported any deviation from expected behavior. The women could not leave the palace grounds. Communication with the outside world was either heavily restricted or completely forbidden. Letters home were censored or blocked entirely. Family visits were rare and took place under close supervision. Inside those walls, social dynamics ran on a single axis: proximity to the emperor. A woman who caught his attention could rise from maid to consort almost overnight. A woman who fell from favor could find herself reassigned to the laundry, confined to her quarters, or simply erased from the record with no explanation given. This created an environment where every single relationship was transactional. Alliances formed and collapsed based purely on access. Friendship carried real risk because if someone you were close to fell out of favor, association with her could mean punishment for you. Accusations of disloyalty, witchcraft, and sexual misconduct circulated constantly, and the consequences were never abstract. Women were executed on suspicion of poisoning. Women were beaten for speaking to the wrong person. Women vanished from their quarters and were never mentioned again. This system ran continuously, dynasty after dynasty. The women changed, the rules did not. And then Zhu Kong took the throne. He was never supposed to be emperor. He was a regional prince from Hubei province, far removed from court life, when the Jiajing Emperor died in 1521 without an heir. The court selected Zhu Kong as the closest eligible relative. He was 14 years old. His early reign was dominated by a prolonged conflict historians call the Great Rights Controversy. The court demanded he posthumously adopt the previous emperor as his father, a symbolic move meant to legitimize the succession. He refused. He wanted his biological father recognized instead. The standoff lasted 3 years. Over 200 officials were arrested. 17 were beaten so severe during public floggings that several died. He won. That confrontation set the pattern for everything that followed. The Jiajing Emperor learned that applying direct force without negotiation produced results. The bureaucracy learned that this was a man who would not tolerate being told no. By the late 1530s, he had largely stopped governing. He attended fewer and fewer court sessions, communicating with ministers only through written notes delivered by eunuchs. For stretches of months, no official saw his face. The reason was specific. He had become completely consumed by Taoist practices aimed at achieving physical immortality. This was not casual spirituality. He constructed dedicated altar complexes inside the Forbidden City. He employed rotating teams of Taoist priests. He participated in rituals that lasted for hours, involving fasting, meditation, burning talismans, and consuming alchemical preparations. 2 men in particular, Xiao Yuanji and Dao Zhongwen, gained enormous influence by convincing him that immortality was genuinely achievable through the right combination of ritual and chemistry. He believed them completely. And the substances they prescribed required very specific ingredients. This is where the historical record becomes difficult to sit with, not because the sources are unclear, but because what they describe is consistent across multiple accounts. The Jiajing Emperor's alchemists prescribed a substance referred to in court records as red lead. Its production required young women, specifically girls, who had recently reached puberty. Court physicians and Taoist priests supervised the extraction process directly. The sources described forced regimens designed to manipulate the girls' biological cycles through herbal preparations, restricted diets, and physical exhaustion. The exact number of girls cycled through this process is not known, but lace records from the period reference hundreds. They were brought in through the regular selection process, used in these preparations, and either retained or discarded when they were no longer considered useful. Before sunrise, sometimes as early as 1 or 2 in the morning, palace women were required to go out into the imperial gardens and collect morning dew from specific plants by hand. This dew was used in alchemical preparations and had to be gathered before dawn because it was believed to lose its properties after sunrise. The women performed this in all weather. In Beijing's winters, temperatures dropped well below freezing. Their clothing was not designed for cold exposure. Women who collapsed were punished. Women who failed to collect enough were punished. Women who visibly fell ill were removed not for treatment, but because illness was interpreted as spiritual contamination that could compromise the purity of the ingredients. Girls involved in the red lead process were placed on controlled diets and given specific herbal preparations on rigid schedules, some of which contained ingredients now known to be acutely toxic. The documented side effects included severe abdominal pain, hemorrhaging, chronic fatigue, and death. The girls who died were replaced through the same pipeline that had brought them there in the first place. There is no record of any girl ever being returned to her family. What made the Jiajing Emperor's court distinct from earlier dynasties was not the existence of these practices, but the scale and the duration. As each preparation failed to produce immortality, the alchemists prescribed more elaborate rituals, requiring more participants and more extreme conditions. The obsession intensified over decades, rather than tapering off. Women serving in non-alchemical roles were not shielded from the atmosphere this created. The entire palace operated under heightened surveillance and punishment. Minor infractions that in previous reigns would have drawn mild corrections now drew responses more appropriate to serious crimes. Beatings became routine. Confinement became routine. And every woman who witnessed punishment understood exactly what the pattern implied about her own future. This went on for over 20 years. The assassination attempt of 1542 was not spontaneous. According to the investigation records compiled in the days that followed, records preserved because the court needed to document the full scope of the conspiracy, the plot was organized over several weeks. The ringleader was Jiajing, a palace maid. The records describe her as someone who had served long enough to understand the palace's rhythms, the guard rotations, the emperor's habits, the points in the evening when surveillance was lightest. She recruited 15 others. The investigation named most of them: Yan Kain, Su Chuanfeng, Xin Wan, Liu Mioxing, among others. Their ranks varied, but they shared a common position at the absolute bottom of the palace hierarchy. These were not politically ambitious women. The investigation found no external conspirators, no connections to court factions, no backing from anyone with a stake in a succession dispute. Every source that examined the plot reached the same conclusion. These women were trying to kill the emperor because they wanted the conditions of their lives to stop. The plan was simple because simplicity was their only option. Knives and sharp implements were strictly controlled inside the inner palace. Poison required access to the emperor's food supply, managed by a separate unit chain with its own security protocols. Strangulation required nothing beyond what they already possessed. They selected a night when the emperor would be sleeping in the quarters of consort Cao Tao, one of his current favorites. The location mattered because it sat within the inner residential complex where the security presence was lighter than in the formal palace buildings. The timing was calculated around the guard rotation. The 16 women entered the chamber after the emperor had fallen asleep. Some sources suggest they had rehearsed their roles beforehand. Who would hold which limb? Who would handle the gag? Who would apply the cord? Several women pinned his body to the bed. Others forced cloth into his mouth. Jiajing looped the silk ribbon around his throat and pulled. He fought back. Despite being held down by multiple people, he was not immediately subdued. The struggle caused noise and movement. The women had to continuously adjust. At some point during the strangulation, he lost consciousness. His body went still. Then the knot jammed. Whether it had been tied incorrectly beforehand or was displaced during the struggle, the cord would not tighten further. The women pulled, but could not complete what they had started. What happened next decided everything. One of the 16, a woman named Zhang Jinlian, left the chamber and went directly to Empress Fan. She reported everything. The investigation records offer no clear explanation for why. Some historians read it as panic, others suggest she may have been coerced into joining the plot and saw this moment as her only chance at survival. It didn't matter. Empress Fang sent guards immediately. They reached the chamber while the other women were still inside, still struggling with the cord. The emperor was found unconscious but breathing. Court physicians worked through the night. He regained consciousness by morning, but did not speak for the remainder of that day. The investigation moved immediately. All 16 women were seized. Interrogations began within hours and continued for days. The court's central concern was not the women themselves, but the question of who had directed them. Was this a court faction, a foreign power, a rival claimant to the throne? The investigation found none of that. What it found instead was something the court had no real framework for processing. 16 women at the bottom of the palace hierarchy had independently decided to kill the emperor because their lives had become unlivable. The investigation did expand in one direction. Consort Cao, in whose chambers the attempt had taken place, was placed under suspicion. The women had known the emperor would be there that night. Had she provided that information? Consort Wang was also implicated during interrogations, though the evidence connecting her was thin. The strength of the evidence turned out to be irrelevant. Both consorts were included in the final sentencing. All 16 women were convicted of high treason under Ming dynasty law. The principal offenders were sentenced to death by slow slicing, a method known as lynching, carried out publicly according to a prescribed judicial sequence. All 16 received this sentence. Zhang Jinlian, the woman who had gone to the empress, received the same sentence as the others. Her cooperation bought her nothing. Min law applied collective punishment to treason cases. The sentence extended outward to family members. Fathers, sons, and brothers were subject to execution. Female relatives and young children were typically enslaved rather than killed, assigned to military households or government labor operations. For 16 women, that meant parents, siblings, and male relatives of sufficient age were all executed. The total death toll resulting from the 1542 attempt is not precisely recorded. But based on the number of conspirators and the standard application of collective punishment, historians place it in the hundreds. Entire family lines were functionally eliminated. The women's names were entered into court records, not as individuals, but as cautionary examples. The documentation was preserved specifically so that future palace populations would understand what happened when the order was challenged. The attempt did not change the Jiajing Emperor's behavior in any meaningful way. He did not reform the palace. He did not scale back the alchemical programs. He did not address the conditions that had produced the conspiracy. Instead, he moved deeper into the palace complex, further from any area accessible to servants. He increased the eunuch security presence. He reduced the number of people permitted near him to a small circle of trusted attendants, and he intensified the rituals. In the years that followed, his consumption of alchemical preparations increased. New Taoist advisors replaced those who fell from favor. New groups of young girls were brought in through the same selection channels that had always supplied them. The court, during this period, functioned almost entirely through written communication. Government decisions moved through layers of eunuch intermediaries. Ministers submitted formal proposals and waited months for responses. Meanwhile, the empire faced genuine crisis. Mongol raids along the northern border intensified. In 1550, forces under Altan Khan reached the outskirts of Beijing itself. Pirates and smugglers controlled the southeastern coastline. Provincial administration deteriorated as the central government became effectively absent. On January 23, 1567, 25 years after the assassination attempt, the Jiajing Emperor died. He was 60 years old. The cause, according to court physicians, was mercury poisoning. The alchemical preparations he had consumed across decades contained heavy metals in concentrations that accumulated in his organs over time. The substance he believed would make him immortal were what killed him. His successor moved quickly. Within months, the Taoist priests were expelled from the palace. The alchemical programs were shut down. Several of the most influential eunuch advisors from the previous reign were arrested and executed. Officials imprisoned during the Jiajing era were pardoned. Administrative failures accumulated over 40 years of neglect began to be addressed. The palace system itself, however, did not change. The concubine structure remained. The selection process continued. The hierarchy stayed in place. The Jiajing Emperor's court was extreme, but the system that made it possible was not something unique to him. When the Jiajing Emperor died in 1425, 7 of his concubines were selected to accompany him in death. The practice required the women to die on the day of the imperial funeral. Surviving records describe the procedure. The selected women were brought to a designated hall. Ropes were suspended from the ceiling. The women were made to stand on platforms, place the nooses around their own necks, and step off. Eunuchs supervised the process. An account from a Korean envoy present at a Ming funeral describes the women weeping before being told to comply. The practice continued through multiple emperors. The Yongle Emperor's death in 1424 resulted in the sacrifice of 16 concubines. The Shonde Emperor's death in 1435 resulted in at least 10. It was formally abolished in 1464, but its existence across more than 6 decades of the dynasty had established something very clear. The women inside those walls were categorized as property of the emperor, and that classification extended past his death. When the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming in 1644, the concubine system was preserved. The selection process continued. The hierarchy continued. The confinement continued. The 16 women who entered that chamber on the night of November 27th, 1542, knew all of this. They had lived inside it, and they chose the only form of agency available to them. If you want to see more stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so more people get to hear these forgotten histories.